Now we have the head of ConsenSys Health Global. Please welcome Heather Flannery.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with all of you. Hello. My name is Heather Flannery. I lead healthcare and life sciences for an organization called ConsenSys. In addition to that particular role, I wear a number of hats in industry. Particularly, I'm very honored to be a volunteer leader with the IEEE Standards Association. So that's terrific. I chair the Standards Development Working Group P2418.6, which is blockchain for healthcare and life sciences. I'm going to be telling you more about that with a particular emphasis on what we're intending to do with identity in the field of healthcare. I also formed a nonprofit trade association under the IEEE umbrella called Blockchain and Healthcare Global that is organized to mitigate barriers to adoption in the field. So we're looking at a whole constellation of 16 barriers that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today as well. And I'm proud to chair the Healthcare Special Interest Group at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and I'm part of the Health Information Management Systems Society. How many acronyms can you pronounce quickly? But I've made it my passion and my mission to drive the positive transformation of healthcare and life sciences with the whole family of fourth industrial revolution technologies, where blockchain really is the mechanism for creating and securing value in that new paradigm. So I imagine only a handful of you in the audience are from healthcare and life sciences, but I'm super curious. Show of hands, how many people work in healthcare or life sciences? Oh, okay. Hey, that's a little bit more than I thought. So very interested in your curation of my ideas. If you want to throw critiques at me after the session, I'm all for that. As we're thinking about blockchain and emerging technologies in healthcare, we have to widen our aperture of context of what we're thinking about and the impact. First of all, this is an incredibly disruptive, revolutionary technology, but we're at a really unique point in human history. We don't just have one revolutionary, disruptive technology impacting our space. It would be as if the Gutenberg printing press and the steam engine and the integrated circuit were all reaching commercial viability at around the same moment, all had vast and complex interdependencies, and all created opportunities as well as risks. So what we are looking at here, and I'm not going to read to you my conception of the relationships between these technologies, what we have to stay focused on is that we're talking about the convergence of these technologies as the primary mechanism of value creation. And in healthcare and life sciences, we have to approach those things with a bioethical framework to manage the risks that we're dealing with. Our industry is now the single most attacked industry with criminal and rogue nation-state level actors continuously attacking the industry, including, like our previous speaker was talking about, the industrial Internet of Things or the Internet of Medical Things. So all of that is this soup of complexity and potential value and risk. Meanwhile, culturally and socially, we as a species have come to understand that this thing called data has value. And ultimately, it will become commoditized, and the original data subjects will become the owners of their data as property under the law. And efficient market functions will emerge for the trade and access of data, and the whole constellation of privacy-preserving technologies paired with blockchain will allow these things to happen in an ethical way, in a way that benefits humanity. The notion that anonymized or de-identified data can be monetized and traded without remuneration to the original data subject has expired in a sense of it being perceived as moral and just. So we're seeing massive transformation in the way that data is captured, accessed, used in our field, and the emotional, social, and cultural connotations around data governance. So if we're thinking about how to transform our industry, there are some additional layers that we have to worry about in healthcare and life sciences. And it's my goal with many, many esteemed colleagues from many organizations around the world to lead this transformation, focusing on these 4 interlocking functions of leadership in our field. I mentioned cybersecurity earlier. Critically important, whether you're talking about decentralized AI and distributed machine learning algorithms, or you're talking about blockchain infrastructures that allow for self-sovereignty and identity and data, those are vulnerable systems. And there's a misunderstanding that simply because the data structure of a blockchain is intrinsically more secure, which of course it is, all of the surrounding systems, all the inputs and outputs, and all the mechanisms by which we trust. The cryptographers may trust math. Does everybody in the room, do you have the ability to repeat the math yourself and see that it is actually done correctly? Verifiable computation, trust at every layer of a stack of an architecture is increasingly important. Privacy isn't just a matter of policy and access, it's also uniquely and newly granular and flexible based on emerging technologies that are entwined with blockchain in some ways, but really are an entirely separate adjacent body of technologies. And those technologies are of particular focus to me. Compliance in healthcare and life sciences, we are a massively regulated industry. All of the private sector companies that function in healthcare and life sciences, be they providers or big pharma or healthcare payers, they are subject to highly variable regulations in every jurisdiction, and those regulations are changing, and there are often oppositional attitudes between the regulators and the private sector, and the cost burden of compliance is enormous in our sector. The regulators aren't happy about it either. They're rather miserable in their work. And so we have an opportunity to totally rethink the way that we achieve compliance, the cost basis of it, the timeliness of it, and the relationships that we have with regulators. And then lastly, bioethics. We haven't had a really major upgrade of bioethics in healthcare and life sciences in about 30 years, roughly, since Belmont 2.0. We have an opportunity now, in light of this converging set of fourth industrial revolution technologies, to think about bioethics as a living practice, to design and implement it methodologically within our project design, within the way that we staff implementations, particularly with the way that we do monitoring and evaluation of impact on our subject populations, on other stakeholders. We watch for unintended consequences, we course correct. All of this was incredibly important with the dawn of the commercial internet and then Web 2.0. But did we know that? Did we realize what we were doing? Did anyone take this into consideration? No, not really at the time. I was there, I was part of it. None of us were thinking about any of that, but we're able to learn. We're able to learn from those mistakes. So, thinking about the leadership and the opportunity to participate and contribute in these 4 interlocking disciplines is, if I have a call to action for you, it's to be thinking about these things and not only thinking about the core technology. This is just a referenced publication of a colleague of mine at ConsenSys Health, Robert Miller, and his colleague, Dr. Gross, at the Johns Hopkins Institute of the Berman Institute of Bioethics. There's a whole series of publications in peer-reviewed journals being developed right now, and some really phenomenal thinking about how to upgrade bioethics for the 4th industrial revolution. You might be curious, if you haven't heard much about what's going on in healthcare. Part of it is because most of the activities is taking place in very large enterprises. Most of the focus is on governance, capital formation, how it is that these large institutions can create mutualized and federated infrastructures. The business models for that don't exist. The legal constructs are nascent. So a lot of the reason why you haven't seen things in production is that in healthcare, you're talking about very large organizations, public and private sector, who must collaborate in a different way than exists in our economic system today. So it's not an immaturity of the technology or any any gap or of understanding about value creation. Instead, it's just not a set of problems that a startup company in isolation can accomplish, which is one of the reasons why the models of doing business in this way are so very interesting. So here in the EU, there is the Innovative Medicines Institute. They launched a public-private partnership with 9 of the largest global pharmaceutical companies in the world. 3 more will soon be announced, bringing it to 12. You can see the founding list there on the slide. Their plan, and they're pooling capital together to do this, is to develop a blockchain strategy for the entire EU, looking at everything from supply chain to clinical trials to population health, you name it. And right now the work is very early, but it is largely at a strategy level, but it's exciting to see these early models taking shape. In the United States, there is the Synaptic Health Alliance. You can see the organizations there. It represents a huge proportion of the total healthcare budget spend in the private sector in the United States. They're further along. They actually have a production blockchain environment working right now to share provider data. And it turns out that even though it's an unsexy, really boring use case, it's got very little glam and appeal, but there was a multi-billion-dollar savings because every one of these organizations all spent money on IT systems, on labor. They all experience costs in the form of negative impact to patient experience, denied claims, you name it, all because when a doctor moves offices, the address doesn't get updated. When they add a new phone number, it doesn't get added. When their privileges are added to a new hospital, one party has that, but another one doesn't. On and on. These little micro demographic data changes create all this friction in the healthcare environment. So now what we've got, for the first time ever, is a shared infrastructure among these parties to maintain in a blockchain-based ecosystem. They're building on Quorum, so enterprise Ethereum. One common infrastructure with shared information in a category that they were able to remove from the basis of competition. What's so interesting about this is it's fascinating for far more reasons than anything to do with technology. This is a history-making example of large, competitive organizations coming together to their mutual benefit, coming up with a governance model where they could actually collaborate, and then getting something done, getting it live in production, and creating value in record time. So cheers to the Synaptic Health Alliance. And I'm going to skip the other, these are some other large alliances. There are many programs making lots of progress. In the US government, there are blockchain infrastructures now in production that have received what's called an authority to operate, which is the official acronym for something that has been blessed from a cybersecurity perspective. Our Centers for Disease Control has multiple pilots underway, interestingly on 4 different blockchain platforms, each looking at disease surveillance on 4 different diseases. So if you list it out, it sounds like something from Fight Club where you're arguing about the support groups, but one is tuberculosis, one is influenza, one is opioid morbidity, and the other one's escaping me. But they're all going after a similar problem on different platforms. So what an opportunity for a standards developer, right? This is perfect. Also, if you're interested in engaging, there are platform-specific organizations through the EEA, through the Hyperledger Project, and Corda's healthcare community, all convening stakeholders, all looking to find ways to collaborate. So just a quick set of thoughts when we talk about blockchain. Everybody in this room probably already knows this, but we're not talking about one thing. You know, it's a type of database, or it's a data structure, or it's all of these things. When we're working with healthcare and life sciences organizations, we're looking at all these different categories that involves, old technology used in new ways, but also applying behavioral economics and game theory to an industry that is literally defined by how distorted the incentives are between the stakeholder groups. So long-term tokenization and the ability to design and run crypto-economic experiments is just going to be totally powerful. And then what's What I just absolutely love, I mentioned this other emerging family of technologies. Privacy in depth is what I'm calling it because you have to have a name. But it's all this stuff. And that is a messy laundry list. Every single one of these are distinct technologies. Every single one of them can be used in concert with the others, can be combined in different permutations. Many can be used absent any blockchain infrastructure. Lots of great tech for off-chain computation, both at the edge and in the cloud. This is a really, really hot area where if you think about everything that you know about blockchain, because you're all blockchain people or you wouldn't be here, start to think about what becomes possible and what sort of constraints we can move around and we can design around with these tools in our toolbox. Because there's no reason we should be drawing our system boundaries strictly to the blockchain and tightly coupled storage or tightly coupled compute. We should be looking at the entire system that runs our economies. And so I encourage you, think big, because there's extraordinary things that we could do looking at these possibilities. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I particularly represent the Ethereum ecosystem generally, and we're talking about both public and enterprise. My organization, ConsenSys, has built a range of enterprise products that are being integrated for platforms in healthcare. ConsenSys Health, my organization, we're extending those things. We're building in the capabilities for compliance, privacy, bioethics, and cybersecurity that are unique to our space. And all of those things ultimately have to be interoperable across chains. We have to have portability of crypto assets. We have to have portability of assets, of identity. We have got to be able to have individual workflows and processes that flow cross-chain. So the role of public blockchains and all of that for discoverability, for example, for security backstops is super important. So we've got a particular vision on the way that side chains are ultimately going to be discoverable on the Ethereum mainnet using Ethereum registration authorities, which is an as of yet notional idea. It's an academic idea, not yet implemented. But at the moment, private blockchain networks, regardless of platform, they're just islands in the abyss. If anybody wants to engage in commerce and trade, if they wish to enroll as a research subject, if they are a patient and they want to start using a digital therapeutic that's built on Web3, how would they find something? Well, somebody would send a fax or an email or make a phone call. That seems wrong. So ultimately, if you wish to get to the public, which in our world means the patient, the research subject, there is a role for a public blockchain, but it can't require high performance, it certainly can't require speed, and it has to deliver the highest level of security backstops. And so, that's just some interesting context here. I mentioned a bunch of possibilities, but boy, do we have problems. I mean, we really have problems in this field. I like to think maybe because we all think that whatever we're taking on is the hardest thing. These are all challenges that we face in the extreme in healthcare and life sciences. And I'll bring your attention again to how few of these, some of them are technical. I mean, a few. Interop, scale, okay, technical. But man, there's a lot of this that is social and governance and economic and capital formation and risk, real meaningful problems that need leadership to get past them. So hopefully you'll be inspired to become a glutton for punishment for volunteerism like I am and get involved in blockchain and healthcare and global under IEEE or HIMSS or EEA, any of these wonderful, wonderful organizations. So if you're not from the space, you may not be familiar with how blockchain is being contemplated. This gives you a deliberately messy laundry list of the kinds of things that are different projects are underway. But if you're trying to transform this interconnected, highly complex industry, how in the world would you go about it? You can't do everything at once. You have to have some kind of cogent strategy. So I developed this thing called the PHI, Protected Health Information Readiness Framework, so that our industry could have one common mental model to think about this transformation. On the x-axis, you've got time and PHI involvement. And on the y-axis, you've got the stuff that matters, population health impacts. By what percentage did you reduce the morbidity associated with diabetes in a population, for example? So I conceive of this transformation in 3 stages. We're in stage 1 now. There are live production systems. There are many implementations. I've already talked about several of these, but the key idea is that they don't use any health data. And at first, it may seem unintuitive that you can do anything in healthcare without using health data, but it turns out you can. There's a lot of things that happen administratively in what is arguably the largest single economic sector in the world that never touch any health data. But if you really want to solve some problems, if you really want to make a dent in the world, you got to get over to stage 3. And these are the holy grails of healthcare. So right now, those 16 barriers that I showed you a minute ago, they stand in between stage 1 and stage 3. So what do we do about it? Giant looming question mark, right? So clinical research is, I believe, our industry's core strategy and the correct approach, both ethically and legally, policy, compliance, all of it. It is the right way for us to approach this. And that means anything that you see in stage 3, we can do that now, today. If the parties involved simply have the will and the commitment, it can be done right now in heavily regulated markets, just like the EU, if the work is organized under a research protocol. And then, importantly, in the research protocol, the impacts of this novel technology are included as secondary and tertiary endpoints. So if you think about this phrase, bench to bedside, you may not have ever heard it, but it takes, by bench it means basic laboratory research. Somebody makes a core innovation, a novel molecule, a new protein, something like that. It's 17 to 25 years later, on average, when that core invention, that core discovery has been translated, commercialized, and you, for example, could arrive and present for a clinical encounter and receive a treatment, a diagnostic, a therapeutic, what have you. 17 to 25 years is not because it actually takes that long to do the research. There's massive capital problems, huge amount of risk, an incredible set of challenges, one after another, that slows that process down. We have the opportunity now, with this body of technologies, to rethink the whole thing. We can rewrite it. And this is my view, in an extremely high level, of how we can use the same platforms, the same technologies. I'm not talking about ultimately different projects. These are things that can be built as milestones on the same infrastructures. Moving from capital formation through market research, being able to enroll participants, you might be surprised to know that when clinical trials are stood up, and many times they have many sites, it's frequent that a site in a clinical trial won't recruit a single patient. Not because they don't want to, but because it's hard, and it's complicated, and it takes work, and all the data is a mess, and the infrastructure is terrible, and so on and so forth. So we have the chance to change that completely. What we do in scientific publishing, how we share data. Right now in this field, you'd be surprised to know that we spend globally trillions of dollars generating data sets that under our regulatory environment can only be used one time. And then guess what? If they're de-identified, the subject patient, who maybe now you know would benefit from a gene therapy, say, oh, well, you can't reach them. They can't be identified. If you want to recruit them into a trial, but you know they're in the population, now you have to start an entirely additional and separate data capture and engagement process and spend more billions. So imagine a future where data is abstracted out of all of these systems and all of these silos. It's neither identified nor anonymized or de-identified. It's owned by the subjects of the data, the patients, the research participants, and they can control access to it in a granular way. They can delegate authority to a custodian if they don't wish to handle it themselves, or they're underage, or they're infirm. And now this data that has been abstracted away can be used again and again and again. It can be aggregated with other data sets. It can be curated. I don't know if anybody ever told you this, but when they buy big data sets in healthcare settings that are anonymized, it's often not great data. Or it's not that clean, it's not that perfect, it's not as wonderful as it sounds, or they make it sound. If the originating data capture was done in blockchain-based infrastructures, either clinically or in clinical trials management systems, the data integrity and quality would be so radically different, it would be hard for the industry to imagine the magnitude of that impact. Post-market surveillance, pharmacovigilance, everything that it takes to comply. Once a study is completed, now you have to go do pharmacovigilance and you've got to do post-market surveillance. Oh, that means you have to set up and capture a different IT infrastructure, all new data, all new people, separate regulators. Here we go again, right? So imagine the data abstracted away into patient-centered, self-sovereign infrastructures. And finally, we have the ability to facilitate value-based agreements. You develop what's called real-world evidence that would be more verifiable than any other real-world evidence sources presently being used today, all the way to accelerating the process by which guidelines are developed, which, by the way, greatly impacts innovators' ability to receive reimbursement for their new innovations. So that process of updating guidelines can be greatly improved by this. So it's not going to be 17 to 25 years anymore when this evolution and this revolution finally occurs. How fast could we make this happen? I don't know. I'm not willing to throw out a time, but it's definitely not going to be 17 to 25 years anymore. So all of that I was talking about as stage 3 use cases, they require a number of foundational things. Patient-mediated data exchange, aggregation, curation, and I should add monetization here, are all foundational. And instead of thinking of that as a use case, just like identity, it's actually an underlying services architecture that applies to nearly every use case that you would assess. Our experience for Web3 dApps, if anybody had to, imagine your dear Aunt Sally and you're like, no, you got to go to MetaMask. No, it's a browser plugin. And oh, you just buy little ETH, it'll be fine. And then you'll be able, completely untenable. Totally untenable for healthcare settings. So we have new software development kits on Ethereum that obfuscate the need to buy any ETH, run a wallet, have a MetaMask account entirely to the sponsor owner of the dApp, or the decentralized app, instead of to the user. That revolution in the user experience is totally critical path. If we don't make that happen, then we're really gonna hit a wall. The data sovereignty trending socially and culturally, I don't expect that to slow down anytime soon. I think it's only going to accelerate. The ability to have mature market functions and to take the idea of consent management, whether in clinical research or in actual clinical care settings, and abstract that entire function into patient-centered infrastructures and out of the electronic health records that are implemented by providers. So quick call to action for those of you that are willing to volunteer, that are from the space, that have domain-specific knowledge. We need your help. The challenge of addressing this space and addressing all the opportunities and challenges of standardization is simply enormous. I chair this working group. You can see the subgroups that are currently authorized and at work. Specific to identity, I wanted to share a concept that we have and that we're working on in the healthcare identity subgroup. So it begins with the DID from the Decentralized Identity Foundation that you're all probably familiar with. And what do you need to do to a DID if you want to make identity work for healthcare? What's necessary? So we want to extend the concept to include metadata for identity type. Are you a patient? Are you an object? Are you a location? What are you, this identity? And then develop a network of non-fungible tokens that implement secure compartmentalization so that we don't have to be subject to corporate or governmental hegemony by all of our intrinsic data being cross-sectionally analyzable, such that we could lose our freedoms. So it is incredibly necessary to be able to compartmentalize contexts of identity. Sometimes this is called personas. We're calling it compartmentalization. And we need a framework for how we measure attestations with biometrics, and then a measure of degree of assurance, so a rating system, so that you can make decisions about how assured this particular identity is. And then integration models for national digital identity programs so that countries around the world can have a global standard that they design to as they are increasingly implementing digital IDs. And so with that, if you have a desire to volunteer, this is also Blockchain and Healthcare Global under IEEE. That's 2 contexts. Would love to work with you. And please remember, it's a team sport. These are some of our toughest questions that we have to work on, and they're really not very technical. They all have to do with business and economics. So thank you very much.